Chris, we're sitting in the dark.
We are.
With just our phones to light the way, in solidarity with our colleague Claire Frisbee from Look North, who was presenting the breakfast news this week when this happened.
Hello, good morning. We start with an apology. We have got a problem here in the studio with the lights. I hope that you can still hear me and we will still be able to run our reports.
So yeah, that's our solid. Has that ever happened to you?
Well, I kind of often feel in the dark, just more generally. Yeah, no, exactly. No, it hasn't. But there is that kind of weird thing sometimes when you just think, yeah, if one bit of kit's not working, is any of it working? Is anyone hearing this?
This happened to me once when I was presenting Newsround on CBBC, and in the middle of the opening music, that all the lights in the studio went down, and so it was too late to do anything about it. We just had to go ahead. And you just saw me on TV, and I was like a little cartoon, just the eyes in the dark. Also, if I was a better friend, I'd be using this as an excuse to then bring in a birthday cake with some candles on it. Because it's your birthday soon, but I haven't organised that.
And it was yours a few weeks ago.
Yeah, so we've got the room in darkness, but no candles or cake. So
do you know where the light switch is in here?
Hopefully we will find it during the opening music of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the studio.
And it's Chris in the studio.
And we're not alone in the Newscast studio for the first half of the podcast, because we're joined in here by Sir Alex Allen, who until 2020 was the government's independent advisor on ministerial interests. And I had to read that job title because it is a bit of a mouthful.
It is a mouthful, yes.
And the reason we got you in was because we thought potentially at this point in the week we might be discussing the outcome of the inquiry into whether Dominic Raab, Justice Secretary and Deputy Prime Minister, was guilty of bullying his staff. But we're not.
We're not, because we're still...
Or we are in theory, but not in practice.
Yeah, we're still waiting. So there's been this investigation that's been going on by a senior lawyer for 5 months, pretty much the entire time that Rishi Sunak has been Prime Minister and Dominic Raab has been his deputy. Last couple of weeks, the speculation was growing that the outcome would be imminent, or at least the report would be completed. I was getting wind last night. Yeah, it's pretty much done. It lands on the Prime Minister's desk on Thursday morning. All the indications from Downing Street in the last few weeks was that there would be a pretty quick response to all of this. Crucially, I was speaking to people this morning in and around government who said, we've been told the outcome is coming today. Not just the report, but crucially the Prime Minister's decision on the report. And it isn't. So it's taking a little longer. Now, in the grand scheme of these things, journalistically, we get excited by a delay of a couple of hours or maybe overnight, as it will be at least. I guess if it comes tomorrow morning, then people might forget about this timeline in a few weeks' time. But inevitably, it's prompting conversations about why. Now, the Prime Minister's a pretty assiduous reader of this kind of stuff. He won't have just skimmed through the executive summary. And it's
Chris,
detailed.
Your phone is buzzing, so I'm going to let you have a little look at it, just in case there's any news. But Sir Alex, while Chris is looking at his phone very rudely while you're talking, no, but hopefully you're not offended by it. He's checking what's happening. How do you feel about how this investigation was initiated and being carried out? Because this is not the usual way of things, is it? Getting
no,
out,
well, it's very odd, because it came when there was a gap between Christopher Geidt resigning and Laurie Magnus being appointed, and where an investigation into all these allegations about Dominic Raab was needed. And so they had to find an independent barrister, as it happened, to do it. So, that certainly isn't the norm. And, one of the things that it's reported, I don't know how accurate this is that he's been asked specifically to judge to present the facts of what happened and not to give any view on is it breaching the ministerial code. So it's that which the independent advisor would do. So
what are the implications then of that bit of the process not happening?
The independence seems to be that the Prime Minister is going to have to decide, which is certainly, I don't think is very satisfactory, really.
I think that's precisely exactly what is happening, and maybe part of the explanation for it taking a little time, because along comes this, I think, from what I hear, pretty weighty report. The Prime Minister, in amongst everything else a Prime Minister does, and at least part of his diary today involved doing stuff other than looking into the future of Dominic Raab, because there were certain things in the diary that Downing Street didn't want to take out. Having to read it, having to come to a judgment, and having to work out what to do. And there are those tonight who are saying, perhaps it's not particularly cut and dried, that if it was very obvious, then the Prime Minister could make a political decision and not suffer too many consequences as a result, albeit there's the practical consequences if you fire somebody of having to replace them. If it's more in the balance, and there are friends of Dominic Raab who think it very well might be, then it's trickier, isn't it, for a Prime Minister? And, we don't know if that's where it is because we haven't seen it ourselves. But there are certainly those who are asking that question, and it seems that's a reasonable question to ask in the context of something taking longer and there being something of a vacuum.
There's a big contrast with the investigation that Laurie Magnus did into Nadim Zahawi, where, he completed it in about a week and the Prime Minister dealt with it in a day.
I was going to ask, you've got experience of investigating claims of bullying in Whitehall and government departments, because you did that when it was Priti Patel, the then Home Secretary, who's facing those claims. How do you go about investigating whether bullying has happened between a boss and an employee?
Well, you take evidence from both the employee and the boss. And in that case, I was supported by a very good woman from the Treasury Solicitor who did most of the interviews. And she then produced a very lengthy report, which I sort of adjudicated on. And my view was that what was found did amount to bullying, and that was a breach of the ministerial code. Well, as you know, the Prime Minister disagreed with me on that, so I resigned.
Ways, yeah.
But one of the things that is perhaps different from this investigation is that in the Priti Patel case, one of the things that she hadn't been warned or told anything about that her behaviour was, causing distress to staff or anything like that. That was one of the things I said in my report was, in future there should be better arrangements for telling a minister if their behaviour is causing concern. And again, the press reports seem to indicate that this did happen, at least in some cases, with Dominic Raab. So that's a just difference between.
So already in the Dominic Raab case, it seems that there are things present that weren't present in the Priti Patel case.
One of the things that I said was, even if unintentionally, and there was a bit of, questioning on that. But it is clear. The Chartered Institute of Personnel has a guidance note that says, even if the sort of things that happened are not intended, it can still amount to bullying if staff are cause distress or things like that. So and I don't know to what extent that may well be the case here too.
On the basis of the testimony that we've heard reported in the media relating to Dominic Raab, clearly it's partial. Is it your instinct that perhaps he is a bully?
I don't know. I'm not going to judge that on the basis. We'll have to wait and see what the report says.
Good try, though, Chris.
We should say Mr. Raab denies it.
Yes, and has done it publicly quite a lot of times because he's been asked about it a lot for the last 5 months as this has been hanging over him. And just to rewind back to what you were saying right at the start, when you were saying that the way this has happened with the QC doing it and just looking apparently into the facts rather than reaching a verdict, and then the Prime Minister deciding, you said that was inappropriate. Why is that?
Well, I do think that it's putting a lot on the Prime Minister. I feel, in some ways, either the person investigating should draw a conclusion from what they've investigated, or, in some ways, should the ministerial advisor be then brought in at the end? It's an open question. Really.
So could you see a situation, and I should just correct myself, I said QC, when obviously I meant KC, but can you see a situation where if there's, a dispute between Rishi Sunak and Dominic Raab about what this report actually means, and I'm totally speculating here, that it maybe then gets referred to the independent advisor and they decide if the ministerial code's been broken?
It's possible. I have no idea. But they would, they would advise on whether the ministerial code's been broken rather than necessarily decide.
Yeah.
I guess part of your analysis on the situation we find ourselves in right now is one, it seems to me, and tell me if I'm over-interpreting here, that this is symptomatic because of the appointment of a KC as opposed to it being looked into by the independent advisor because there wasn't one at the time. That part of this process is a symptom of the chaos in politics that came before.
Well, it's certainly a symptom of the fact that there was, been big gaps in appointing independent advisors, which isn't very satisfactory. Though, I think Laurie Magnus is an excellent appointment, and as he showed with his Nadim Zahawi report, is very able to look at things quickly and decisively.
And Chris, Rishi Sunak is facing his own kind of little investigation into behaviour, isn't he? We found that out this week.
He is. It's a sort of week of discovering about investigations. So yes, there was an examination of what he said or didn't say, in particular around his appearance in front of a committee of MPs a few weeks about the liaison committee of chairs of select committees. And this is around the declaration of some shareholding that his wife has, an organisation called Koru Kids. Back in the budget, there was a big focus on boosting free care for preschool children in England. As part of that, there was a pilot project involving childminders and childminding agencies. One of these, it turns out, Prime Minister's wife is a shareholder in. He was asked explicitly in this committee, when talking about this, do you have anything to declare? And said no, it's all been registered properly. Now, again, a consequence of the turbulence in politics in the last year was, as at the time, the list of ministerial interests hadn't been published. So he might have given it to his officials and said, look, here are all my details. Firstly, those officials decide what goes into the published list. Secondly, the published list hadn't seen the light of day. So there's now an inquiry going on as far as his declarations are concerned. Number 10 say they believe they've done everything that they possibly could have done. Keir Starmer, actually, the Labour leader, found himself in a similar little brush with the investigators last summer, and it kind of blew over. Number 10, I guess, will hope that it does for him as well.
But they have this week, Laurie Magnus did publish the list of ministers' interests, which did include Rishi Sunak's declaration of his wife's interest in that company. So that is now out in the open. And I think Laurie Magnus made the very good point in his introduction that it's too intrusive. You can't really expect somebody to publish every shareholding their wife holds. What they do need to do, and what, as I understand it, is done, is that they're declared to the relevant officials in their department and in the Cabinet Office, and where there are particular
but we
ones.
only in the public get to see it afterwards.
Yeah. No, I mean,
It'd be good to know beforehand.
Well, I mean, I think that it's very difficult to argue that somebody's entire portfolio should be in the public domain when most of it will be completely irrelevant and nothing to do with it. And it's only when there are particular issues like this one that I think it was appropriate that was included in the declaration that was published.
To have a big portfolio. Sir Alex, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm always a fan of Newscast, so I'm very delighted I was asked to come along this afternoon.
Great to hear it. Now, Chris, there is an amazing documentary to watch on iPlayer. It was on TV earlier this week, and it's Deborah James, a.k.a. Bowel Babe, and the 5 years she spent living with her bowel cancer. And it's made up of just loads and loads of her home videos and her phone videos and clips from behind the scenes of their podcast, You, Me and the Big C, that she did with Lauren and Rachel Bland.
Yeah, I've not seen it yet, but yeah, I used to work with Rachel at Five Live, which is kind of our kind of age. Went through, obviously, a horrific time before her death. I was at her funeral, but kind of quite a legacy, really. Transformed like the national conversation, really, about cancer, talking about it in the most stark, blunt terms, and also the reality of living with it, knowing that it's going to kill you. She wrote a brilliant book as well called For Freddie, for her son. I was in New Zealand over Christmas seeing family, and we were in this middle of nowhere rural library, and the book was on the shelf.
Oh, wow.
And I texted Steve, Rachel's husband, and said, what a legacy. That kind of sense of someone you work with, horrible, horrible circumstance, but that kind of legacy that she and the other members of the crew left and continue to articulate.
Well, earlier on, I was very privileged to have a chance to chat to Steve, who was down the line, and also to Lauren, who was 1/3 of You, Me and the Big C with Rachel and Debs. Lauren, hello.
Hello, darling. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Very exciting to have you here in another podcasting studio. I wouldn't say rival.
No, never a rival, because baby couldn't beat us, you know what I mean?
No, that's why I wasn't going to say it. Yeah, it wasn't out of politeness, it was just out of reality. And Steve, hi there, how you doing?
Yeah, good, thanks, Adam. Nice to be here.
Before we dive into talking about this week's documentary, Steve, you've had some other developments this week.
Yes, it's been a big week. On Monday morning, we had twins. 9:15 in the morning, we had twins. Ruby and Luca arrived, and they're, just an absolute joy. So it's been a whirlwind week. I apologise if Lauren, you have to jump in if I'm making absolutely no sense. I've basically not slept in I don't even know what day. Is it Thursday today?
Yeah.
Anyway,
Babe,
Sunday.
I've been doing that on the podcast for years, darling. Don't worry.
So Lauren, I watched the documentary on iPlayer. I actually watched it on my tablet, propped up in bed, so it felt very, very kind of intimate. For people who've not had a chance to see it yet, what will they get?
What they will get is a real look of Deb behind the scenes in all facets. So the whole thing is Deb in her own words. It's archival footage. So it's everything from the podcast to friends such as myself who shared footage from their phones to family VHSs that 40 hours worth they went through to get bits and bobs. And it just shares exactly what the essence of Deb is about, but also her experience from the start of the pod to sadly when Deb died last year. And I think, I'm not going to sit here and sugarcoat it and say it's an easy watch. I think if you've been affected by cancer, it does really pack a bit of an uppercut to the feels, I'd say. But there is something about Deborah and the energy that she had. And I don't even like saying had, that she has, because I do feel like we've all got a bit of Deb clinging to us since she's gone. You can't help but watch the documentary, come off the back and just feeling like, A, what a massive loss, but B, God, we've just got to live. We've got to do the best and we've got to look after each other and we've got to make a difference. And I think that is something that just brings me absolute warmth. And I think she'd be incredibly proud of what the guys have done.
And Steve, there's so many amazing bits, but there's one bit that really hit me when she's just finished writing her book, and I was like, she wrote a book in the middle of all that as well, and that's on top of all the promo she was doing and the podcast and the visiting her friends in all different corners of the country and exercise and the kids and everything. A typical day for her was long and busy.
A typical day for her was not a typical day for everybody else. She wrote 2 books actually. She wrote one early on in her cancer journey, and then she pretty much nailed through one in the last couple of months of her life. When at the same time, by the way, she was raising 7 million quid, becoming a dame, launching a clothing line, all in the last month and a half of her life. It was just extraordinary, and like Lauren says, this documentary so perfectly captures it. We're very lucky because Deb was someone that documented everything. A lot of the material came from the podcast, but also from things like her own recordings when she was in hospital after a lot of treatment. She's in hospital, and she started recording all these amazing recordings, hours and hours and hours of her mostly coherent thoughts overnight, and just like Lauren says, it is just an hour and a half ish of just unadulterated Deborah. It perfectly captures her essence and her spirit. It's fantastic.
There's a very touching bit in the program where she's talking about doing all this stuff, but then she talks about the preparation she has to do and the cost that it comes with. So she might have to sleep for a whole day to be able to go and show up to something for 2 hours. And I just wonder, I probably hadn't quite realized that at the time, because I just saw the good bits.
That was why Deb became so popular. That's why so many people related to her, because it was warts and all, wasn't it? It was literally everything. It wasn't just the good bits. It wasn't just the dancing around. It was, particularly through the podcast, but also her social media. It was when it got, really difficult as well. And there were loads of moments over the 5 years where she thought, my time's up, or there was a point where in the documentary, her skin goes very badly affected by some of the treatment, and that was over Christmas 3 years ago, Lauren, 4 years ago, and she started writing all letters to her kids, because she thought that was the beginning of the end. It was a really rough ride for her, and the treatment, did take a massive toll. I think what she achieved in spite of that is just extraordinary, and like Lauren said at the start, just taught us so much about how to live. And it's not, what I think is beautiful is that you don't get an impression of it being a tragic story. It's not a sad story. It's not a sad film, as Deb says in it herself. Her story is a hopeful one. It should, people should take massive hope from it, because her story, the fact that she lived for 5 years, got to see all these, got to make all these amazing memories with her kids.
And there's a lovely bit where that all comes together, and it's her doing her chemo dancing with her son, and you actually see him growing up, actually up in height as this is all progressing.
So we always used to do this thing called chemo dancing. I would come home high as a kite on steroids, and we would just dance. The last time I did it, he was half his height. And I was like, this is what research what medicine has given me. It's given me the opportunity to see my son become taller than me. And I think that's incredible.
I said to Hugo at the funeral, I said, I could tell that you didn't really want to do it a second time around. And he was like, no, she made me.
But Lauren, that sort of illustrates the dilemma that a lot of people who are getting cancer treatment must go through, which is the treatment is pretty horrible. So you have to work out whether it's worth it for the stage that you're at.
Exactly. I like, you know, all anyone wants, and Deb says it in the doc, all anybody wants is more time, more life, right? And, you know, as you just discussed, like, she had to weigh up, okay, so if I'm going to do this, then I have to rest, because, you know, we as friends of Deborah, the amount of time, and I know Steve can like attest to this, we'd be like, okay, can you just rest this week? But there was no stopping Deb, because she, you know, it's a very niche situation to be in, a unique situation, and not one that I envy, where you don't want to stop because you know your time is limited. So Deb, for the last 5 years of her life, was constantly just going, I'm doing it now, because she didn't know what the next scan would present. She didn't know how the next round of treatments would treat her. So she genuinely just went, okay, I'm doing it.
There's one bit that I think I'll remember for a long time, which is where one of the friends of the podcast, Kel,
Mm-hmm.
and
Kick-ass Kel.
yeah, and it's during lockdown, and she's not able to have her chemo, and that has horrible, basically fatal consequences.
To a few months ago,
I got a text message from you. It says my chemo's been paused for 12 weeks and I'm fuming about it.
that's the day lockdown was announced, wasn't it?
Yeah, treatment was stopped. And since the treatment has stopped, everything was just growing out of control. And that's when they said that there's nothing else that we can do now.
Cal, how do you actually feel? Like, honestly?
Absolutely terrified. I don't want to die.
That for me, and I'm sure you feel the same, Steve, because we talked about it afterwards at length, when we recorded that podcast and Kelly's face flashed up on the screen, it took our breaths away, because you know, we'd seen Kelly prior and Kelly looked like Kel, do you know what I mean? And all of a sudden we're looking at somebody who you can visibly see doesn't have long left, and it was gut-wrenching, because obviously as well the pandemic just caused so much distance, like even for us as friends, like Deborah, Steve and I barely saw each other. And I think that's what is really hard about Deb's death as well, is that I don't feel like we've got most of physical in real life Deb in the last 2-3 years. But yeah, no, it was hard to relive and rewatch all of that. And to be honest with you, like when we were going down to like the funeral and be there and stuff, I was a bit like, Deb, what are you doing with like these cameras? Like, it's a funeral, what are you doing? And it was only in hindsight looking back and seeing the impact and the reason, like Deb was all about, we need to shake people up and see that this needs to change. We're losing people because of COVID. We're losing people because bowel cancers are getting diagnosed late. So, you know, at the time, I was a bit like, what are you doing? Do you remember, Steve? I was like, now I was putting a camera in my face.
It's a really good point there about Deb, kind of more broadly. A lot of people will tell you that when they, first came across her on Instagram, they think, oh, she's a bit of a show off, a bit of attention seeker. And she was an attention seeker, she liked it. But it was, that was her doing what she thought would give her the biggest following and the most exposure and the biggest profile in order to help the most people, in order for the most people to hear, her messages about bowel cancer, about the symptoms, about checking your poo, about knowing your body. And that was what it was all about for her. It was never a selfish attention seeking thing, even if that was, quite a nice little byproduct.
Oh, we got this far, and this is the first mention of check your poo. I thought you two would be like saying it the whole time, but we're saying it now. We'll say it many more times in the next few minutes, I'm sure. But Lauren, are you finding friends of the podcast who are, I don't know, caught up in the NHS backlog after COVID, maybe caught up in the strikes that we've had over the last couple of weeks?
I don't think the strikes have been the issue. I think mostly it's been the backlog and access to drugs and the waiting times. I think the biggest issue we face in cancer at the moment is kind of like twofold. It's getting people diagnosed, because so many people have fallen through the cracks with the pandemic, weren't getting things checked. Those who are getting checked, there's longer wait times for results, there's longer wait times to start the treatment. So, and in those times of waiting, that's when cancer can progress quite significantly, which is the worry. It's scary.
That's definitely true. And the thing with COVID and cancer is that we don't need to catch up. we actually need to go well beyond catching up, because just catching up would, there's a lot of people that we've missed, haven't been in the system the last 2 or 3 years. And there's going to be, an awful lot of work needs to be done to get those people into the system, people whose early stage symptoms have been missed, to people who've missed, key operations during COVID.
The stories that I'm getting a lot of the time from the community, because, I'm quite lucky that I'm embedded in the community. I feel very lucky to have people share their experiences with me. But what we're finding is that, it's almost like you're stage 4, so it's not with that urgency of like, let's get you this drug, let's do that. And just because your life may be limited to some degree doesn't mean it's not a life worth saving or prolonging. Deb is a testament to that.
Well, that's the other thing from the documentary, and I don't mean to sound ghoulish when I say this, but I hadn't realised how long she'd lived a good life while being very, very ill. Like, in my mind, it was a much quicker thing, but actually she had years.
There's years, and I think that's the thing is with the advances in medicine, which Deb highlights so well in documentary, and she always talked about. She, first part of defence is, getting diagnosed early. But where we are getting the late diagnoses, the best thing we can do is access to drugs, knowledge, patient-led care, genetic testing, all of that stuff, so that we can make sure if you are at a stage 4 diagnosis, you can build more memories, more time. You can kick the can further down the road, was Deb saying. And that, I think, is a real big focus I would like to see more energy and more budget put into, because, if we have got all these people because of COVID that are diagnosed late, what are we doing to prolong and extend their lives?
Do you think the system maybe hasn't caught up to the fact then that there are more stage 4 people out there? And it needs to adapt a bit.
I think it's been an issue for a while. I think it's been worse since COVID. Because access to treatments, wait lists, things like that, people, if they're gonna look and there's a young woman walking in and she's like, primary breast cancer, easily treated, and then there's someone who's older and they think, okay, we probably can extend her lives by 2 years or whatever, they're gonna, the budgets tend to be shifted into people whose lives can be, that we can say, cured. But I don't think that's necessarily, I don't think it's the right thing, because, Deb is the gold standard in my eyes. Like, we need to be buying people more time. We need to make sure they can make more memories. We need to make sure that they can leave a mark, and that's what we need medicine, and we need the advancements for, which Deb is funding.
It's also not one or the other, is it?
Yeah.
It's, we should be covering all of this, really, shouldn't we? Because, Deb was a perfect example of how treatments are evolving and what people with stage 4 diagnoses can do, how long they can live. 10, 15 years ago, Deb's diagnosis, she'd have been gone within a year, I imagine.
Yeah.
So,
that's what
it's amazing.
Told her, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Treatments, are coming on unbelievably well. And then, but we still do need to talk about the early diagnosis, because, if Deb had known about her symptoms when she was first, getting them, about the weight loss, about the blood in her poo, things like this, she might have been diagnosed at an earlier stage. So treatments are just incredible. You're more personalized, so the side effects are less. And it's a really exciting time, actually, to work in cancer.
Well, thanks for your time today, Lauren.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you.
And thanks, Stephen. Good luck with the new arrivals.
Can I add one thing before we go?
Please do, yeah.
Check your poo.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Check your poo.
And you can check your poo, now, because that's the end of this episode of Newscast. Although, do it whenever it's convenient. I'm not saying you have to do it right now, but thanks very much for spending time with us. Bye.
Newscast from the BBC.